to introduce our featured speaker for today. I'm very pleased and honored to have to be able to introduce Blake Page, who is representing the Military Religious Meeting Foundation.
When I was a teenager, like many people who grew to become atheists, I was very interested in studying the Christian religion. There was one topic in particular that I found very interesting: the concept of holiness. Everything magical and mysterious was holy, but what did it mean? What did it mean for something to actually be holy? How could something become holy? I had a few other questions, but ultimately, I found the answer to this one was very simple. As my pastor at the time explained to me, holy means separate, special. It describes a state of being which should be treated with the utmost care and respect. After a while, I grew to understand that the premises of the religion at large do not align with the realities of the world I saw around me. But even without faith, the concept of holiness remains something that I regard as rather valuable. Of particular relevance today, I would like to say that I believe the founding document of this country ought to be regarded as holy. Our Constitution should be handled with the utmost care and respect, only to be tampered with under great deliberation. As participants in the social contract we've been born into, we are obliged to evaluate the merits of that contract. We should defend it when we see it in danger of being discarded. We should modify it when we see it as a cause of harm. But we should also respect it as individuals, or else it has no value. With or without the Constitution, I do not see us as very far removed from the state of nature. As a country, we go to great lengths to demonstrate that these United States are well organized under the law. Our leadership and government in these halls follow established protocol, execute their duties according to their concept of what is right, and what they feel they must do to preserve our freedoms. Or so we hope. That is the ideal, but often that is not reality. While we were founded as a pluralistic country, our founders did not do so in a genuinely pluralistic nation. The laws of our social contract were hardly in effect in those early years. Slavery, segregation, misogyny, intolerance of homosexuals, and intolerance of the irreligious were written into law in contempt of the equality demanded by our Constitution. The guardians of our way of life were hardly living up to the roles in which they found themselves. Today, the impact of those early failures of conscience continue to prevent the United States from fulfilling its mission, being a welcoming home to the people who regard life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to be inalienable rights. While religious privilege is executed throughout the government in many forms, we are here today with an eye on our armed forces. Traditionally, our military has been a highly religious institution, although not a lawfully religious institution. Consider the history of West Point. Perhaps the most venerated of the military academies, West Point first experienced the Theocratic leanings under the command of Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, who is also known as the father of the military academy for his great efforts in legitimizing the institution. It was under his command, as superintendent, that chapel attendance became mandatory. All cadets were required to attend Protestant Christian services, regardless of their faith, and were required to publicly demonstrate their allegiance to that specific religion through the singing of hymns and recital of quite specific prayers. Very few cadets had the courage to refuse these services, but cadet and later President Ulysses S. Grant was one of them. Not only was he punished with demerits for his refusal to go to church, but this man was arrested for his activism, incarcerated for disagreeing with the majority. Of course, he was released fairly quickly after it became apparent that failing such a religious test was not lawfully punishable in this country. Sadly, though, the policy of mandatory chapel attendance remained in effect. It did not stay for a few months or years, but more than a century, until 1972. On that front, reason appears to have won. As many of you know, that is not the case. While formal policies will show that the military currently respects the freedom of choice, informal policies all too often dictate otherwise. It is true that soldiers in basic training are not required to go to church. They typically have the choices I did, many of you probably had, to polish floors or scrub toilets instead, or at best, to be kept in quiet isolation from their peers. This is something that's been reported so many times for so many years that we may be tired of hearing it. I'm tired of hearing stories of religious coercion. Hearing soldiers' complaints about compulsory prayer, the rewards offered for religious participation, and punishment and lack thereof in so many places, so many times. It's difficult to find entirely new instances of religious privileging, because it seems that every report we get in the Military Religious Freedom Foundation is a recitation of something we've heard before, with new names, new locations. While this may be tiring, if our combined passion to see the endurance of our Constitution through the face of those who seek to overturn it burns out, then the cause is lost, and reason will lose, and we will lose. But I don't think that'll happen. I don't think we have it in us to quit. The stakes are too high. Many have accused me of being a quitter. In some ways, that's fair. I didn't quit on my path towards graduating from West Point. I quit that endeavor, so that I could join you in one which I view as much more important. After all, there are many things I was not allowed to say within those very grand falls. A cadet, a soldier, a marine, an airman. No one in uniform is allowed to question our government. The officers appointed over them, our president. They're not free to doubt the legality of the decisions of their superiors without accepting severe ramifications, legal, social, or otherwise. When I found out I would be speaking here today, I had no idea what I would talk about, which rhetorical audience I should address. Then I remembered a question a friend of mine asked me several months ago. I was in a car with Jason Thorpe, who's the president of the Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, on a road trip from one deep south coast to another. He asked me, if I had the chance to talk to the president, what would I say? That question got stuck in my head for a while, a long while, and eventually I took the time to write my thoughts out. And now I have a letter here to the President of the United States that he'll probably never see, will probably never respond to. But it could just as easily be for any other member of Congress, any state representative, here or otherwise, any governor, really any individual with the capacity to influence policy in this country. Because I know that I personally can't write signing statements or sponsor a bill. And here is that. Mr. President, you don't have to look very far into our past to recall a time when a man of color holding the office you do now was not more than an idea relegated to the distant aspirations of young people and the musings of fiction writers. Yet here we are. It took the sacrifice of political capital and careers, endurance of public shaming, and in some instances death, on the part of many once ordinary men and women who made the hard decisions necessary to bring about a society in which you could even dream to compete for such a prominent seat in government. Through those hard decisions, they grew to be the giants of history, on whose shoulders you now stand. In 2008, you told me and the rest of our country that you believed in a secular government. On this topic, you said, and I quote, that you were hopeful that we can bridge the gap that exists and overcome the prejudices that all of us, to one degree or another, bring to this debate, and that you have faith that millions of believing Americans want that to happen. While it is true that millions of believing Americans want that to happen, it is not those millions of moderates that are attempting to establish official state religions, as recently happened in North Carolina. Luckily, that will fail. It's not those moderates trying to restrict the freedom of women to decide whether or not to give birth, as we see in North Dakota and elsewhere. It's not those moderates who seek to ensure the scientific illiteracy of our country's youth by teaching mythology in classrooms, or to allow parents guilty of the intentionally negligent death of their children, they call it faith healing, to walk free, or dictate that nearly 9 million Americans do not deserve the right to marry their romantic partner. No, Mr. President, this is not the work of moderates. These theocratic leanings of our country are not spontaneous. Study after study have shown that non-believers are the least trusted group in this country. with public opinion putting us on par with rapists. All other qualifications aside, a mere 54% of Americans would ever even consider voting for a non-believer for president. While these figures may be unsettling, they cannot be a great surprise considering the efforts of Christian dominionist leaders in our government today, such as my neighbor, Michelle Bachmann. The same group rallies behind the 1954 and 56 additions to our American cultural heritage with the slogans, "In God We Trust," and "One Nation Under God," actions which were an appeasement of Joe McCarthy's self-proclaimed final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. These words are not benign. They are an historic precedence of modern Christian nationalistic rhetoric, often echoed within the halls of government, here, even throughout the ranks of our military. This is rhetoric that bends policy, that affects human lives. As the Commander-in-Chief of our country's armed forces, you are in the position of command authority over those many men and women in uniform fighting for something. I say it that way because I have a difficult time believing that our military is fighting for the American way, the ideals of true liberty and justice for all that you and I were promised as children. Over half a century ago, it was determined that the leadership of public schools could not lawfully abridge the freedom of Americans' children by requiring them to take part in daily prayers. Yet today, that same concern for the dignity of our soldiers is discarded. While some argue that the ceremonial deism we see in our military is encompassing of all people, I challenge that notion, along with tens and thousands of others. After all, what is the difference between compulsory prayer in a public school and compulsory prayer in public defense? While the tarnished history of our military and respecting the religious freedom of its members is nothing to be scoffed at, it would hardly be noteworthy if it were simply that, history. But when the Military Religious Freedom Foundation has more than 33,000 clients, 96% of which are Christians, by the way, from every branch of service, our military is in need of reform. If our leaders in government believe in a representative republic, I would ask that you produce for us a representative chaplaincy. As it stands, the chaplaincy does not come close to demographic alignment with the religious diversity of our armed forces. If the purpose of the chaplaincy is to provide for the spiritual needs of our service members, admit to the need of humanist chaplains, as so many of our allied nations have already, with nothing but positive effect. If you believe that prejudice should be combated instead of tolerated, I ask you to make a genuine effort to ensure that people like Major Jonathan, Christian fighter pilot Dowdy, are not given free rein to encourage bigotry, loudly and publicly, without punishment. I'm writing to you in the hopes that you have the courage to stand by your words, your expressed ideals, and your citizens. I'm challenging you to take the time and sacrifice the political capital necessary to genuinely pursue a more perfect union. I'm writing this in the hopes that you can consider the defense of those who defend this country as something worth your attention, but more importantly, something worth investigation and remediation. There are a great many men and women struggling for equality and secular government, free of the tyranny of the majority in this country. The ACLU, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, many member organizations of the Secular Coalition for America, and more. Will you rise to the challenge as well so that one day in the future, my peers and those that follow will be able to stand on your shoulders? Or will you leave that position to waver men? Thank you for your consideration.